Those who are out on airways, we're glad you're here. I'm not Russ. Russ is on his way to Michigan for the holidays and be with his family. I'm going to let him teach his material. I selected some material that I'd like us to look at this morning. It's going back to the Gospels. We're going to look at one of the miracles. There's a couple of them mentioned in here, but one particularly we want to look at. So if you want to turn to Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22. This miracle is also mentioned in Mark, and it's also mentioned in John. Mark and John are pretty close to the same. Matthew's a little different, not much. And it's an old story, and we've read about it. But what I'd like you to do this morning is to look at the characters that are mentioned in this story, or in this miracle. And at the end of class, I'd like to ask the question is what we can learn from this, how we can apply it to our everyday lives. It's in here for a reason. These people are mentioned, and I think we need to take the time to look at it. And we'll notice in Matthew, Peter is mentioned in it, but in Mark and John, he is not. And I think that's due to who each writer was writing to. To give you, it's where Jesus walks on water, but to give you a little background, just before this, he was with a multitude. He was healing the sick and taking care of everybody's needs. In verse 14 of Matthew, verse 16, he has compassion on these people, and it's getting late in the day, and he wants to feed them. And he gives them, somebody comes up with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he feeds 5,000 men. That's not counting women or children. With 12 loaves of, 12 loaves, he had 12 loaves left, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And again, take this setting, Jesus is performing miracles. He's healing the sick. He's taking care of their needs, and now he is feeding them as well. He's been with them all day. He's tired. He's kind of wore out, and this is where our story begins in Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22. And I'll read it. It says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent the multitude away, he went up into the mountains by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was all alone. But the boat was now in the midst of the sea, tossing by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when his disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But the multitude, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." Then Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter came down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind was blustery, he was afraid and began to sink, and he cried out to Jesus, "Save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand, caught him, and said to him, "O ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they had got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those who were on the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "He is truly the Son of God." This story starts out with him satisfying the multitude, and after he'd done all that they've asked of him, performed miracles basically, and feeding them, he sent them away. This shows me that Jesus was tired. He wanted to be alone. He wanted to be with his Father for a little bit up on the mountains and pray. So he sent everybody away. Now you notice on the boat, when he put the people on the boat, it's not only the apostles, it's disciples. So it's more than just the 12 that are on the boat. This boat is amazing to me. Jesus goes up in the mountain. I want you to think about the people that we talked about. We got the multitude we just fed. We got the disciples put on boats. We got Jesus on the mountain. And I'd like you to think about their attitudes while this story is portrayed, and our attitudes as it's portrayed. The disciples are set on a boat. They're put out into the sea, and they're in a storm. Now, from all I gather, these boats were not very big, or ships were not very big. So I don't know how many people were on them. Their main motivation was to make the boat go was by rowing. And the sea that they were on, it's called the Sea of Galilee. It's about the size of Lake Erie, Lake Superior. And it sits down in a valley, and it's surrounded by hills and mountains. Of course, the wind comes over these hills and mountains and goes down into these valleys, and that causes the storms that they're in, blustery storms. At about, I don't know how long it was, but they were only out 3 or 4 miles. And the boat's not going anywhere, and they're rowing. That's how bad the wind was. You ever been in a canoe and crossed a lake, and the wind and the other boats going by? It's hard to row against that wind. That's what these disciples and these people that were on the boat were doing. And in John chapter 6, verse 18, it says the winds were great. In Mark 6, chapter 48, which is basically the same story, says they were straining to make any movement at all. Then about the 4th watch, about 3 a.m. in the morning, Jesus came to them walking on the water. So we've talked about the multitude, we've talked about the disciples, now we're talking about Jesus. I want you to think about their attitudes as we go through this. And in verse 26 in Matthew, it says the disciples were troubled, saying when they seen him walking towards them, they thought it was a ghost or a spirit. And in verse 27, Jesus tells them not to be afraid. In the books of Mark and John, it basically says the same thing about them. Then we get to Peter. Peter's a different kind of character. He says, Lord, if it's you, command me to walk to you. Now, mind you, there's a storm brewing. The winds are blowing. They can't go anywhere. The boat's basically at a standstill. And Peter says, let me walk to you. So Peter gets out of this perfectly good boat. He trusts Jesus for a little bit, and he starts walking towards you. The winds are blowing. The boat can't go anywhere, so that means the waves are pretty high. And Peter gets out of a boat and starts walking to Jesus. Then he sees the rough waters and the winds, and he becomes afraid. And he starts to sink. And he cries out, save me. And of course, Jesus reaches out with his hands and saves him, pulls him up. And he says, why do you doubt, ye of little faith? When Jesus and Peter got into the boat, the seas became calm. The people on the boat, the disciples, they worship him, and they said that he was truly the Son of God. You can read basically the same story in Mark and in John. Luke doesn't write about it at all. Peter's only mentioned in Matthew. But I want to go back and start looking at the people that are mentioned in this group. I want to start with the first multitude. When just before Jesus sends them away, he feeds them. He takes care of all their needs. My question to you, what was their attitude? In John chapter 6, in the same story, John states that Jesus perceived that they wanted to make him king. And that's why he sent them away. So in our minds and our hearts, what do we think about this first multitude? They'd just been fed with 5 fish and 2 loaves. He's in a few verses before that, he's taking care of all their illnesses and their sickness. What's their attitude? What would be our attitude? Come on, talk to me. Make this class go. Drew, I'll pick on you. What do you think their attitude was? They were excited? Okay. Ricky? The multitude, the first multitude, before they got on the ship, before they were divided or sent away, they were fed. Everything that was wrong with them was fixed. What do you think their attitude was? Mm-hmm. Okay, Ricky says they were satisfied because they've been fed, their bodies have been taken care of. You also mentioned that they understood. What do you mean by they understood?
Well, they were all following him because of, quote unquote, what they had heard about this man. So they all came to see for themselves and experience what they had heard. And so, it's like, well, Drew might have said this about him, but Drew might have got it wrong. I want to see for myself. I want to experience it for myself, firsthand account of what he has done, what he can do, according to what he has said.
Okay, Ricky says basically that they wanted to see what was going on. They wanted to see it for themselves. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Okay. So what you're basically saying is they were worried about themselves and what Jesus had to offer. Okay. Okay. But then we get to the part where Jesus sends them away. Why do you think that Jesus would get rid of the multitude? Why would you think that he would get rid of his apostles and disciples that were with him and go up on a mountain by himself? Okay, very true. He left his father to come to earth. He needed time. Okay. Needed time to commune with his father, Jen? Okay, he just found out John the Baptist was beheaded, his cousin, so he needed some grieving time. Okay, Jody says we forget that Jesus was a man as well. Okay, physically, mentally, was probably exhausted. Did Jesus want the crowd to make him king? Do you ever wonder why? You know, Jesus is a human being here, and I don't want to take anything away from God, but Jesus is a human being like you and I, basically, in the same form. And this multitude, because he took care of their needs, he perceived that they wanted to make him king. Why wouldn't he want that? Jody? Wasn't God's plan. Okay, very true. It was not God's plan. God had a plan set and he's in motion, and Jesus wasn't about to change it. Okay? But in the same token, the individuals in that multitude would not understand that he was king already, because they were just being taught that story about him and what God had to offer. What about the disciples, excluding Peter, that were on the boat? You ever thought about them? They're on this boat. It's being tossed about. The winds are terrible. They're afraid. What do you think was going through their minds as they see this dark shadow walking across the water? Fear? Very good, Ricky. Fear? What kind of fear, Ricky? Okay. All right. Okay, very true. How could it be they, seeing an object coming at them, a human being walking on the top of the water when they're in a boat, being tossed and thrown about? Then, what's that? Yes, it was dark. Okay. It was dark. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm only suggesting that maybe it was a full moon where they could see. It may not have been. I don't know. It could have been Jesus' light. It doesn't really tell us, but they could see a figure, a form coming at them. They really didn't know who it was until he spoke to them, and he told them not to be afraid. Then Peter says, Peter is an outstanding individual. Peter's not afraid of anything to start with. If you look at this, he says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come out and walk with you on this water. Already he's forgot about the storm. He's forgot about the waves. And he's leaving a perfectly good boat to walk with Jesus. Why would you think that he'd want to leave a boat and walk with this object or Jesus coming to him? Think about that attitude, Jen. Mm-hmm. Okay. How much did he trust him, though? Verse 29 or 28. Yeah. Yeah. He trusted him at that point, we'll say, because later on we find out he takes his eyes off the Lord and he sinks. I would think he would. Yes, sir. Very, very true. Those who were on the boat also, their faith, they had faith, but it was very little at that point. Peter trusted Jesus. Okay, Ricky. Mm-hmm.
He didn't say, "Oh, I know it's you and I believe it's you." He said, "If it's you," which is, I'm gonna test whoever this spirit is out there, because I'm not 100% sure here. If it's you, command me to walk on the water, and if it is you, I'm sure that if you command that, I can do it.
Okay, very true. That word "if" is in there. If it is you was Peter's. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Could it, yeah. That could Peter was very, very out in front in most situations that we read about Peter. You know, just in the garden when he cut off some ears, he was very out front, very jump to action type of man. It does seem odd, but yet he trusted a little bit. He had a little faith. Uh, in today's society, there's a lot of people that have faith. They believe in Jesus. Okay? But do they really have faith? And that's what we're looking at here with Peter and these apostles and disciples. They've seen these wonders. They've seen him heal. They've seen him feed 5,000 men. That's not counting women and children, with 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. And after they all ate, they had 12 baskets full. Grace? Mm-hmm. Okay. Pe- okay. Okay. Peter, as Grace said, he took his eyes off of Jesus. And I think that's a problem us today as individuals we have with, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Jen? Mm-hmm. Okay. He gets out of a perfectly good boat and he starts walking on water. His eyes are fixed on Jesus, and all of a sudden, he starts looking at these waves. He starts feeling the wind, and his faith kind of shrinks. It is a storm. His faith kind of shrinks, and then he cries out for Jesus, and of course, Jesus is standing there with his hand out to help. But if you look at Peter, he starts out in a lot of his situations, and you can look at the event that happened on the cross or just before the time of crucifixion. Peter's always out in the front, going to do this, going to do that. But then when it comes down to it, his faith boils off until he's given the keys. Of course, we know in the book of Acts, he's given the keys to the kingdom and he becomes a great preacher, a great minister, a great apostle. But up until this time, do you think he's sure Jesus is who Jesus is? Mm-hmm.
It's not the first time. He said that to them more than once. And again, I think it's that human side of us, the human instinct. Peter was, I think he was a man of action, but he was impulsive man of action. Let's do something. You don't sit here and talk about it for the next hour. Do it. And you get into the middle of it, and you're like, whoa, I don't really think this thing through. You guys in the middle of this one. The boats, I don't know how many feet away from you, Jesus, because I don't know how many feet away from you. And now I realize I got out of the boat, I walked on water, that thrill is over. Now the reality of what I stepped into, stepped out on, stepped in, which is there's a storm, waves overtaking me. I started out. Again, that human side of us comes in. That natural fear, that survival instinct says, what have you done?
Okay, Jody? Right. Okay, very true. Our faith, sometimes being honest, it comes and goes because of what we have to deal with. And if you're kind of like me, I like to take things head on and handle things myself. Kind of like Peter. Peter was more or greater than I am, basically, but he tries to take care of things himself and handle it. And then he takes his eyes off of what he should be doing, or he doesn't think things all the way through. What's going to happen to me if I really get out of this boat? And I think that's why Jesus said, ye of little faith, because he didn't put all of his faith once he got on the water and he started looking around. He wasn't focused on Christ anymore. And I think we get out in that same thing. Us as Christians, we get out there by ourselves on that island with just us. And we take our eyes off of that goal or what we're reaching for. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very true. Peter, I don't want to say Peter had faith because he seen what Christ could do to a degree. Okay? But when he gets out by himself in a crowd, it becomes a lesser type of faith. He still believed, but he wasn't believing enough to get himself in trouble at that time. Jen? Well, it was either the boat or Jesus. And he figured Jesus was closer. We'll put it that way. But you really look at this, he didn't cry out till he started to sink, till he got in trouble. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's Peter. And he didn't cry out until he got into trouble. He started to sink before he cried out. He knew he couldn't handle it anymore by himself. And when he cried out, he knew Jesus was there, close to him, and could help him. My question is, what's the difference between Peter's attitude and the other disciples' attitude? Think about Peter. Peter says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you. Did the other disciples say that? What was their attitude in this boat, in this storm? I know it wasn't recorded, but well, according to the scripture, it says that they were amazed and they worshiped Jesus once he got on the boat because the winds died. But up until then, how do you think their attitude was? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. All right. Uh, it's amazing story. We read it about how often do we think about the people that are mentioned in this storm, in their attitudes and their situations they were in. That's why when I like to look at these things, there's a reason they're mentioned to us. There's a reason these people are mentioned. So I like to look at their attitudes, their situations, and what they're going on. Now, as they get back to the sea and they get into town, there's another multitude that gathers. And evidently some of them were on the other side that Jesus sent away earlier. And they seen that Jesus, and according to the scriptures, they didn't see Jesus get on this boat. But yet, when the boat docks, Jesus gets off. What do you think their attitude was? These are the people we read about, and we read situations that they're in. If we were in that situation where we seen the apostles get sent away, the multitude sent away, and they leave, and then later that next morning we see Jesus get off a boat that he didn't get on. Now you put all these people together that are mentioned. Do you think they were worried about Jesus being Christ or being their Savior? Or were they more worried about themselves and what they could get? You know, Jesus had a big following, okay? We know that. There were multitudes of people following him, but there wasn't multitudes that were believing him. So a lot of these people that came to Jesus just came to Jesus to get what they could get. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, Christ went to the cross. He was by himself, other than his favorite apostle was with him, and his mom was there. But yeah, and you got to look at the situation that there was a lot of people that were poor in this situation as well, and it could be instances this is what the only way they could get anything to help them survive during this time. I don't know that to be true, but you know, Jesus was willing. He had compassion on these people. He's willing to help them in any way. Even the apostles and the disciples. But yet he says they have little faith. And that's the question I have is, how do we take what we've learned in this miracle and apply it to our lives today? I know none of us can walk on water. We can't see Jesus. We can't feel him. We know the miracles that he performed back then have ceased. So how do we take this story and apply it to our lives to make it useful for us as Christians? Is the question I want you to think about. You know, it's a miracle. He sunk. Who did Peter reach for? He reached for Christ. He reached for the only person that could help him at that time. Okay? In today's society, who do we reach for? Again, and I'm just as guilty as the next person. Most of the time I try to figure my problems out myself and I don't reach for Jesus. And that's where we fall short. That's where we start sinking. Jesus is standing there today just like he was for Peter with his hand out. Let me help you. How many of us are willing to reach for that hand? How many of us have faith that he will take care of that problem that we may have, that we can reach? He took care of Peter's. You think about it, Peter was in trouble. He was sinking. He was about ready to drown. And he reached for Jesus. How deep do we have to go before we reach for Christ? Jen? Okay. Peter, and again, Peter's seen stuff that Christ had done, so he had some faith that Christ could help him through any troubled times, or he wouldn't have left the boat, I don't believe. But yet he had little faith because he took his eyes off of it. Okay. Took a lot of faith. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
For a long time. Even when we get to the garden and Peter draws the sword, it was because he's still in his posture. His physical response is the kingdom here, not what's to come. And so our promises, what Jesus and God promised us is never that we're going to have certain physical things and certain physical expectations. And so it's really what our God has to do. When you get to about the boat, they went across the water, right?
Mm-hmm.
To the other side. Those people wouldn't even see them get in the boat again.
Well, there's one of the script, I don't know if it was Mark or John, does mention that the multitude on the other side did recognize Jesus when he got off the boat, and they knew that he didn't get there. So evidently there was more boats, more way of travel for people to get on the other side as well. Yeah, Matthew mentions they reckon. I think it's. Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. They recognize him, but there's one. Let me find it here real quick. We're almost out of time. I think it's John. Yeah, however, other boats came from Tiberias or whatever, however you pronounce it, near the place where they had ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. But when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? So they weren't, that in itself was a miracle. But the thing I'm trying to get out of this is using Peter as our guide. When he got in trouble, who'd he reach for? Who'd he cry out to? And that's who we need to be crying out to, is when we get in trouble, when we start that sinking part. Okay, class time is over. Thank you very much for all your comments. I hope you enjoyed the class. I'll be back next Sunday with another one. Thank you.